Hello and welcome to episode 5 of our series with Mascha and Elena Berg. And today we want to talk about what we're calling the small water farmer, which we really feel is a really central episode in this series, really tackle what we mean by a small company that cares a lot about its product. Last time we talked about the distinction between natural and processed water, and we talked about how you can distinguish tastes via minerality, pH, carbonation, etc. So we're going to move into talking about this small water farmer concept and also the responsibility that these companies have in promoting environmental sustainability, whether or not they have this responsibility, and what companies have been doing.
Yeah, so it's interesting. When we say small water farm, of course, we don't mean the water comes from a farm, but we want to use the symbolism, the equity that we have in the word small farm. And currently, if you're a foodie, and if you listen to this show, you're a foodie, you care about food, you care about where it's coming from, how is it processed, how is it integrated into your Epicurean experience. And there's currently a movement called the farm to table movement. And it means that the food that you consume, you know where it's coming from. Maybe you have a relationship with the people where it's coming from. Doesn't mean you know them, but you know them through a website, you know them through communication. You have an idea where your food is coming from. And if you go to a restaurant, chef utilize also this kind of relationship they have with the people they produce their food. And if you talk to the sommelier in your restaurant, they also do the same thing. They have a relationship and know where their wine is coming from. They've probably visited the place. And we found it very strange that we don't have that relationship with water. And tapping into the equity of this in farm to table movement, of this idea that you know where your food is coming from, we would like to explore if we could utilize the concept of a small water farmer for our idea that water is not just water, and this idea from moving from a processed commodity product to a product with terroir.
Yeah, I think that's something that's really distinguishes these big companies that sell processed water, that's essentially tap water that's been filtered another time or put through another process and sold, with a myriad of these small companies that are taking water from very different kinds of sources, right? Like they may be glacial waters with low TDS, they may be these very high mineral waters from volcanic layers. So I think this concept is about really understanding where the water is coming from, rather than just assuming that it's coming out of a tap.
And you can imagine, and if you ever had this relationship with one of the small farmers, you know what's important to them. Their livestock, their soil, their ground, where they produce, they understand that that is the most important part they have on their farm. And I've talked to many small artisanal producers, like the size that Elena mentioned now. And the most important thing for those people is the land, the catchment area, where the water is coming from. This idea that they need to protect what they have on their farm, so to speak, in order to have a high quality product. I think that's very important. And the thing you notice, if you have ever talked to a small farmer that grows your vegetables or raises your livestock, you will notice the people doing it for money. Yes, they need to make some money, but there's passion behind it. It's the same thing when you talk to a winemaker. You look at the dirt in its fingernails, and you can see these people do it because they really want to do it. They have passion about it. And I think so there's this concept of having passion about water and trying to share what you have with other people, I think is on the core of this concept, what we call the small water farmer.
Exactly, and in some cases you have water, you know, we talk a lot about eating local and this sort of connection to nearby lands. And with water, sometimes that's the case, right? Like sometimes certainly in France, there are many different mineral waters that are relatively local for me. But you're also dealing with transporting water through space, and experiencing, what a water from New Zealand tastes like, or South America. So there's an international quality to this too. And so one of the questions that comes into that is, okay, well, how can you protect that source and balance that also with packaging and moving products across the world? So that's why I think there's this interesting kind of relationship between the land, the connection to the land, and these environmental measures, and to what extent those things can be balanced.
Yeah, it's really the shift, in my opinion, from hydration to an experience. And you can have to say, let me go back to wine briefly. Elena mentioned, if you travel to a small region, you eat the local food, you want to have some local wine. And that usually matches very well because people have been used to work with those two elements for a long time. So this local wine concept is very important. And we will talk about water producers that do the same thing. They want to become more local. So you have this local wine, but clearly there's also an international component, because you go home from wherever you visited for your vacation, and you want to have access to that wine too, to get the same experience you had at the place where you discovered the wine first time. You want to have the same experience. So suddenly the local experience becomes an international experience. But with water, sometimes people confuse it and say, oh, we shouldn't ship water across the world, because they think water is for hydration. But again, we want to come back to the idea there are two different products that we call bottled water. One is a natural, one is a processed product. And it makes no sense for the processed product to be shipped. But if you want to have an experience you maybe had, other people told you about, shipping that water for an experience to you is the only way that you can actually experience that water.
I think the distinction here, I think the wine parallel is actually really central to this, because it explains, it elevates the drinking of water to that kind of emotion you have when you're trying different kinds of wine, right? That you're willing to put the time and energy into kind of experiencing those different flavors, because it tells you something about the soil that those grapes have grown in. It tells you something about the story of that vineyard, etc. So it's an attitude shift for not all bottled water, for sure, but this sector of bottled water, the small water farmer, it's this shift to thinking about water like you would think about wine, right? Really caring about those flavors. I think it's worth bringing in now, though, that there's an added tension that doesn't seem to exist in the wine industry about bottling water, right? Like we've mentioned in other episodes that there's a natural tension that comes up when people think about putting water into bottles and what that means environmentally and socially and politically. And my conclusion after kind of all this work I've been doing on this is that we have to appreciate and address that special place that water has. And even if we're thinking of these beautiful small waters as the equivalent of wine, we have this added responsibility that the wine producers, at least that we in general don't put on the wine producers, to address the source of that water and the protection of those sources. And in many cases, many of these companies, it's beyond protecting the source. They take profit and they'll pour it into other water projects across the world, right? It becomes this different political, emotional symbol that we'll talk about more in the next episode. But I think it's worth bringing in early on that water is special, even though in so many ways what we're saying is that it's just like enjoying a fine wine at the table.
Yeah, we will have a whole episode on this, and it will be a very, very interesting episode, because we'll look at the symbolism of water and many other things. I want to come briefly back to this wine and water issue. I'm using the term terroir to describe that a particular water expresses a particular region, a particular geology. And it's, of course, a borrowed wine term, and people in the wine industry use it to describe that a particular grape has a certain terroir, meaning it expresses its surrounding growing in one region, which is very different from growing in another region. And when I compare this to water, I think the wine grows above the ground. Only the roots are actually in the ground. And I think water actually has more terroir than wine, because the water is actually really in the ground and really absorbs all the minerals. And I think I want to remind people, this is the main reason why water is not just water, because water is this universal solvent, and it really attracts all the minerals, all the trace elements in the geology when it is underground for a couple of thousand years, or just for 1 year or 2 years, or even shorter than that. And it even applies to, if we collect rainwater or iceberg water, it still has a terroir because it expresses a certain area, sometimes through the absence of the mineral and not through the addition of the mineral. So I think using the word terroir, because we might have some wine sommeliers here that are listening to us and say, people are crazy, you don't have terroir. I would argue that we actually have more terroir than wine.
Exactly. You may have waters that have not spent very much time on the Earth's surface, that may not have percolated through many layers. But there are many, many kinds of waters that have spent an awfully long time, very, very, very slowly moving through different layers of rock, right? So we're not talking about trickling at a speed that we can really observe. We're talking about extremely slow sinking down over sometimes thousands of years, right? So of course, the minerals in those different layers that have different makeup, sometimes, you know, as you go down, you may be moving between different kinds of rock types. You're going to end up with a really different product once that water is extracted.
I also quickly want to come back to this aspect Elena mentioned, the protection. If you talk about a small farmer and, you know, vegetables, you know, livestock, you immediately have in mind that the people are very protective of their environment, of the grounds where they produce, of the means of their production. And I think the same thing applies to the small water farmer. And if you think about it, there's a big trend now all over the world, and especially it's coming strongly here in the US, is heritage breeds. So we got really used to having pork, and it became a breed that was very easy to raise, didn't get very sick. So the emphasis was on huge production and not on the taste. And people coming back and understanding that heritage breeds really provide a much, much better experience, much better taste. But they're much more difficult. And so people say, how can we protect heritage breeds? And the best way the farmers tell us to protect a heritage breed is eating the meat from a heritage breed, because it gives them the resources to protect and grow the breed. And I see an analogy here to the small water farmers, because if people are interested, can you protect a large area and keep it very natural, keep the industry away, protect the watershed. You can do this by drinking the water that it's sourced responsibly from that particular small farm, giving means to the people that protect the area, and thereby protecting the small water farm, which in the same time protects the environment around it.
Yes, I think that the water is an interesting problem because we talked about this in previous episodes as well, but water moves, right? Water doesn't stay in one place, it flows, and that can have really dramatic implications for what kind of protection is necessary. And that also depends on if you're talking about surface water, groundwater, a particular artesian spring, right? So how we protect a resource, how much we can extract without not only negatively impacting the level of the water, but the surrounding ecosystems is going to vary. It's complex. And that takes a lot of commitment on the part of those that are extracting that water to make sure that they're doing that sustainably. So I think it's a big challenge for people in this industry. And you're right that you might get some nasty people that don't think much about sustainability. There are laws in place that are supposed to manage that. But I would say in my experience, which is, you know, much more limited than yours, Michael, that these small companies really care about making sure that they're not taking more than is replenished, and that they're thinking about the kind of multiple consequences of all those actions and what they need to do to protect that source. Not only because that's legally necessary to be able to brand their, sell their water, right? You have to protect that source, but because this is something that they've become emotionally invested in as well. Like, these are sources that they care deeply about.
Yeah, as I mentioned, the emotional engagement. It's the passion. And I've talked to many small companies, some of them very, very small. I recently talked to someone that is bottling out of his garage because he, by accident, discovered a water source underneath his garage, and he's bottling now very interesting water. So they're sometimes very small company, but sometimes I'm engaging even with larger companies, and they're not really multinational companies, but they're prominent in their particular area or country. And they still have the passion. They still have this passion and this idea of protecting what they have, in the same way that a farmer or a livestock farmer would not overpopulate his area or his area where he raises the animals. The same way, they would be very careful. They engage with geologists, try to deeply understand where the water is coming from, what is the watershed, how much water can be extracted naturally without over extracting. So the size is important. The smaller the people, the more passion you see, because you can engage with the people. But I have to say, I also see a much larger company that have the same passion and integrate the story of this environmental consciousness and not over extracting water and protecting the source into their stories.
Yeah, and you brought up the key word here, which is story, right? That one of the key things that sets these waters apart from a processed water that you buy for hydration is that there's inevitably a really interesting, cool story behind the product, right? How that source was found, maybe the history of that source's use over sometimes millennia. We have several examples we can bring up. One story that I really enjoy is a very new water called 808, which is a French water. And it's called 808 because it's an artesian spring that's 808 meters deep, which is extraordinarily deep. And it's located in a very picturesque part of France that the painters love to paint. It has a really interesting geology, right? So even in the name and many times actually in the name of these waters, you have a really interesting story to go along with that. Another example of, there's so many, but we pulled a few out of that. Svalbard is a really great example of a water that has an exciting story. So this is iceberg water, where in the northern seas, going out and chipping off slices of iceberg that have already calved off of the main iceberg, right? Like my initial response was this is terrible, we're taking away habitat from the polar bears, but that's not the case at all. These are bits of ice that would otherwise just melt. Boats will go out there and have to really put a lot of time and effort into figuring out how to harvest pieces of ice that have been frozen for thousands of years, that are definitely pristine, that don't have any contaminants in them. And the website has a wonderful set of videos, right? What a great way to show the world what it takes to get your water, right?
Yeah, so great stories. And we both believe that the story is really important, because you gain an experience by drinking the water, and you have to have a story. And I want to just quickly remind people of that the waters we are talking about, they have a story, they have things to say. And the processed waters we find in the supermarket, they don't have that story, because their story is, I am tap water that is processed, polished, and sold in a plastic bottle. And those are the waters that have to make up stories. Some waters tell you you'll become smart if you drink it. It's smart water. Other people say you will live forever if you drink alkaline water. So it's so easy to distinguish between the two products, because one has an origin story. It tells you where it's coming from, what makes it special. The other one tells you marketing bullshit. So this is really what Elena is starting talking here about is this distinction between the natural product, which can tell a story, and the processed product, which doesn't have a story, so they have to make up one.
That said, there's an interesting history that's changed recently of making health claims about water, that even some of these smaller companies would make claims that may not have had a whole lot of science to back them up. That's become much harder, at least in Europe. It's become, the laws are much more strict now. You can't claim that this is better for your baby unless you have evidence that it's in fact better for infants. So there are these the origin stories. There's also the health stories, which, as I said, have, I think, become less central to how people sell water in the small water farming world. But it's still there. So Roy Water talks a lot about its magnesium-rich water and its possible health effects there. So you can have different kinds of stories, right? I think the one that's the most enticing for us is the origin story. Where is that water coming from? Another water I really enjoy is Antipodes from the North Island in New Zealand. And one reason why I really enjoy this water is that it's combined sort of the origin story with the environmental story. And it has a long track record of really paying attention to how to preserve its source. So it's in New Zealand. It means that the rest of us who are not close to New Zealand have to see a glass bottle move a long way. But from the very beginning of this company, they've been, it's a carbon neutral company. It's, I think, the first carbon neutral bottled water. They take much less than they could from that source. So they actually only bottle to order. They don't bottle just to have more bottles. They have been selling it in the same beautiful glass bottle. And it's, so they've integrated. They're also very active in the UN. So there's essentially a story about where it comes from, this amazing remote artesian spring, but it's also combined with consistent, direct, clear action to make sure that we have access to that water for years to come.
Yeah, I briefly want to go back. I love Antipodes, and I will talk about it in a second. I just want to briefly go back to the health claim. Yes, absolutely, Elena. In many, many countries, it's not allowed to make real health claims. And some people ask, where does this idea of health claims come from? And it's of course the European or Northern American concept of spas. These are places where the water was available at the source, and we talked about the terrible conditions, starting in the Middle Ages in Europe and highly densely populated areas. So people went to the spas in order to get healthy, and they wanted to bring water home. And bringing the water home, they put it in glass bottle. This was kind of the first evolution of the bottled water industry. And just by leaving the really, really bad city environment, getting into a better environment, people suddenly become much better. And this is where, together with some minerals that are in the water, that the health claim started. So when people now make health claim, I see this a little bit as a health claim, but I see it more as a heritage claim. Look where we are coming from. We're coming from that place where people went for a long time to get healthy, even so it wasn't a direct impact from the water. But on the other hand, also, as we already mentioned, there is an impact from the minerals in the water. So health claims are an interesting concept and more of a heritage claim. With Antipodes.
I was just going to add that you're right that, really until not that long ago, bottled waters were sold in pharmacies, right? Which we've mentioned before as well, because it was seen as a health product, right? Because when people took the waters, they were doing something for their medical well-being. So that's how it was marketed. And there's a lot of residual interest in the kinds of minerals that are in water. And I've tried to dig into some of that literature to look at the basis of some of those health claims. And the best that I've come up with is that, yes, minerals are important to our bodies. Most healthy tap water, right, that has been processed so that it is safe, contains all of the minerals that we might need, right? That if you have a TDS of a medium range TDS like that, you're going to be fine. But that if you're always drinking super low TDS water, you may not be getting as many of those important minerals as you would otherwise. So water is an important source of minerals, but we shouldn't stress out about it and think, well, we have to drink this particular bottled water to get those, because most clean tap waters have the minerals we need in them.
Yeah, again, I'm no medical doctor, but if I understand the science correctly, anemia is one of the sicknesses where you can really benefit from having additional iron, and some of the waters that are bottled at some of the sources have a very high iron content. So this is the closest where I can really see a direct relationship.
Though I think also iron at levels that are too high can be dangerous and can sometimes be filtered out, because isn't it one of the ones that can sometimes be filtered out? So there's this complex relationship between how many minerals you need versus that's too much, right? And that we, the age-old adage of everything in moderation is probably true of water as well.
Yeah, moderation is important. And yeah, if you have too much of anything, it becomes, it becomes poisonous, so to speak. The difference between something that's good for you and something that's poisonous is usually the amount you're consuming. But I would like to add that in the 17th, 18th century, it was probably safer to have a little bit too much iron in your blood than going to the doctor. I think this was probably a very dangerous thing to do back then.
Yeah, I agree with that as well. And I think that, if water is going to be a source of some of those things that are hard to get in your diet, then, again, it really depends on what your diet is, what you have access to. But even with all of these health discussions, I think it's important to note that water is not a medicine, and that there is no such thing as a water that can heal you from particular diseases, and that if you have a medical problem, you should go and see a doctor of some kind who can discuss your problem, rather than assuming that you can just drink a water high in magnesium and you're all set.
Yeah, I agree. Don't listen to anthropologists for your medical advice. See a real doctor. I want to come back to the antipodes. In 2008, we founded the Fine Water Society, which is a group of exactly this, what we want to call now the small water farmers, the small brands, because they could not compete with the big brands for visibility in the marketplace. The big brands had this advertising, and we decided we want to get a group together of the small, and many small things can become a big thing. This was in 2008. And Antipodes was one of the founding members of the Fine Water Society. They started really in the very early 2000s, so they are almost 20 years old, a little bit shy of 20 years. And I met the founder very early on, and I was really, really impressed with, exactly as Elena said, there was not the concept, let's fill some nice water into a bottle. There was an immediate holistic concept of, this is the environment, this is how I protect the environment, this is how I want to go carbon neutral. And this was 20 years ago, so this was not on the mainstay of everything. So it was a totally integrated concept for Antipodes. And Antipodes has been and still is a thought leader in the whole concept of how to tell a story. But when you say story, it doesn't mean that it's not true, but how to tell a story, how to make a story out of the things that I have that makes my water unique, and how I can communicate what water I'm taking and how do I protect the environment. So that's, with Antipodes, a really beautiful thing that's deeply integrated into the core of everyone that works there in the company.
And interestingly, I found that a lot of these companies have very different strategies. So many of them do have some kind of environmental focus, in part because of the symbolism of water, right? Which we'll talk about more. But they have different approaches to that. You have some waters that don't necessarily tell you much about what they're doing to protect that particular resource, right? You might have to dig to find that information, but they will donate a certain amount of proceeds to water projects in various parts of the world. So that's kind of an indirect approach to having an environmental focus. I want to contrast this a little bit to ethically branded waters, which is sort of another category of waters, which to me it's a different sort of thing, because these are often waters that don't have much of a story about the water. So it's, you know, it might just be processed water, but that they make a big thing about, okay, we're going to put water in a bottle, but now we're also going to put 50% of the proceeds into protecting watersheds, et cetera. And those brands have gotten some backlash. There's a general concern about greenwashing. And the greenwashing is essentially this idea that a company makes claims that it doesn't actually meet, about what it's doing for the environment. They use it as a marketing ploy, a way to justify their existence, but they may not actually be doing as much as they say they're doing. So there's always this, you really have to be careful that it's not just, okay, water is symbolic and problematic to people, so I guess we have to slap on some language about how we're protecting the environment. I would argue, no, you have to really step back and think, what is so special about this particular resource? And what needs to be done to make sure you're not taking too much of it? And how can we use this as an opportunity to teach people, outreach to people about the importance of clean water and protecting water and the beauty of water that has all these different wonderful properties that you might not have ever imagined. So it's, as I said, companies have different approaches to that, but the story of that particular water and its origins is always central to it, even if it takes a different approach to how it becomes carbon neutral. For example, Icelandic glacial water, which comes from a glacial spring in Iceland, you know, right there, you can imagine the story is very, very picturesque because Iceland is such a striking place. But they use geothermal. They have very, very low energy impact because of how the energy is extracted. So they have, and that's because Iceland, you know, has a lot of geothermal energy and it doesn't use a lot of fossil fuel. So right there you have an approach that's really appropriate for that context, for that place. And yeah, any other stories you wanted to add? You had mentioned a company to me that really focused on local distribution. I think that's another interesting way to think about the environmental question.
Yeah, I want to quickly, add, and you're absolutely right. We see a lot of greenwashing. We see a lot of companies that started, let's start a bottled water company, and not really thinking how to integrate also these environmental concerns into their stores. And then as the trend to more environmental consciousness arrives, they do some greenwashing and slap something on top. It's better than nothing. It's better than destroying the environment. But I think the really successful companies will have to integrate that into their origin story. This should be at the core of the DNA right from the beginning. And I'm sometimes consulting with companies and I tell people, this is in the core of your DNA, needs to be to answer this question. Why are you bottling this water and how can you tell us you're not doing any harm? I think that's really important. And I also want to mention, we talked before this farm to table concept. And usually when you say farm to table, you mean a shorter distance. You don't want to have the product shipped from Chile. You want to find, if you live in the US, of course, but you want to find it locally. And so there's a local aspect, a local component to it. And we have now, I'm aware of at least 2 companies that have made into their core DNA this local aspect. One is a German company, very small producer that, as I mentioned before, by accident rediscovered a source in his garage that was bottled in the 50s and 60s in Germany, fairly successful for a small brand. And he rediscovered the water. They're a retired couple. And they said, you know what, we're going to reinvent the brand, rebrand it, and start selling the water again. And right from the beginning, even in their name of their brand, they said, I only want to do it in a certain radius around where I live. And the water is called Radius 99. They're saying, our area is 99 kilometers from where I live. This is where we're going to deliver the water, because that's something where I can drive with a truck to this place and I can drive back in a day and I can have my route. I thought this is really, really interesting concept of defining local. And of course they want to ship international. They now have trying to find a distributor because they have been approached in the US. Of course, they want to ship, but their main component is this 99-kilometer radius. And the other things is, as we mentioned before, some other people around the world might want to have a special water, and why shouldn't they be able to do it? Because you can do it with wine, so I think you should do it with water. So that's a very interesting concept from Germany. In California, we have Tahoe Artesian. It's a water from the area around Lake Tahoe, artesian spring. Water is carefully only the water that is naturally given is bottled. There's no extraction below this point of replenishment. And they branded themselves as the local choice. And for them, local means the area is a little bit larger because everything in the US is a little bit larger. So the area is around 200, 250 miles. And we want to be the local water for San Francisco, which is in driving distance. So again, the same idea of overcoming this idea that you have to ship water from the Fiji Islands to a particular place. You can do it if you like the water, but for this more of a hydration aspect, you should also have available a local water. And I think that's also something that the brands will be very careful in the future to address this kind of local and export issues.
I think that there's what's interesting to me about this is integrating the local aspect into the branding, because a lot of waters are local because they simply don't have, I don't know that half of the waters that I've been seeing here in France are really exported very much, right? Like and that's going to be true of many, there's a bunch of Italian waters that mostly Italians drink. There's a bunch of German waters that rarely leave German borders. So a lot of waters sort of become naturally fairly local, right? Because they don't have a marketing base that's taking the waters further afield as much. But I like this idea that someone's going into this consciously thinking, you know what, I don't want to focus mainly on having water sent long distance. So that's an interesting approach.
Yeah, I just want to mention something that we recently discovered is we like a brand from Australia called Aquilive. It's a very high mineralized water, really enjoyable, very different texture. And we talked to the couple that is bottling, again, very small producer, hand-filled bottles. And we talked to them, so do you know where your water is coming from? Because we were talking about this local idea. I said, yes, it's an aquifer, and it's rain that fell in New Zealand. The water is bottled in Australia. I said, this rain that fell in New Zealand 2,000 years ago. There's an underground aquifer between New Zealand and Australia. And the water emerges in Australia 2,000 years later after it was rain that fell in New Zealand. So again, we're talking about local, but as Elena was saying before, water moves. So this defining a locality for water is sometimes very hard. It's usually the extraction point, but just as an idea of thought, we should also keep in mind that water not necessarily comes from where it's actually extracted.
Yeah, that's what makes it so kind of exciting and beautiful, I think, is that it is so mobile and so varied, right? And has such interesting terroir. I think, unless you have other things you wanted to add there, I think it might be a good time to think about the size of companies. So we mentioned this a little bit, that mostly for these small water farmers, we're talking about small companies. But in our previous conversations, we realized that it's actually kind of hard to define exactly what we mean by small, right? Because you might have a company that is tiny and very local and it's easy, but you might have a company that actually is extremely popular locally, but isn't as well known externally. So it's a big company in a particular context, but may not be big globally. And then you also have other companies that are really big, but still have a small company mentality. So I think it's a continuum. My initial tendency was to think, well, you have these small companies, and then you have, what I've been calling the big four giants, Pepsi, Coca-Cola, Danone, and Nestle, right? Which also have very different business models. So you can't lump them all together necessarily either. But those are, in some cases you have these big companies that buy up water rights all over the place, bottle them under one or a few names, and that really is not about the origin story at all. But in other cases, you have like Danone, who buys these small companies and continues to market those small companies that each have their own origin story. So even when you're talking about the big companies or the big four, right, it's what you're talking about may be different, right? If you have Coca-Cola or Pepsi that's packaging tap water, that's a totally different story than a company that owns lots of little companies.
Yeah, I'm working now with Elena for quite a while, and I have learned, one of her phrases she's using a lot. It's complicated, and I think it is really complicated. So I don't have any final answer, but I think it's good that we know. I like the idea that it's a continuum. It doesn't start at some point and end at some point. It's really continuous. The thing I have always, my acid test, so to speak, has been this passion thing. And I talk to a lot of the brands, and within 2 minutes, you sense if the person on the other side is passionate about it. And unfortunately, sometimes I talk not to the big bosses, but to some senior representatives of some of the larger companies, especially around Nestle and Coca-Cola. And suddenly, if you talk to those people, the passion I have for water is totally not visible with them. So they have no passion for the water. They have passion for something else. And they have passion for the spreadsheets. They have passion for profit margins. They have margins for distribution success in spreadsheets. So it suddenly becomes only a business model. I'm not saying that the smaller companies don't have spreadsheets. Yes, you have to have spreadsheets, but it's about the passion about the product. I don't see that passion in the larger companies. It's really about margins and those kind of things that create a business. And again, there's no wrong and right, but we should understand that it's two different things. You cannot compare the two different things. One is this more of a processed commodity product. The other one is the natural product. But I agree with Elena. There are some companies, I've been working with Pedras in Portugal, with Gütig in Ecuador. They're very prominent in their countries, not very well known outside, even though I would like to make them very well known because they're very good waters. But if I talk to those big companies in a small place, I still sense the passion. It's all about the water and not all about the spreadsheet. So I don't have a final answer, but this spreadsheet versus passion, I think, is one of the tests you can make with a company if you talk to people and if you look at their websites.
I think I just made a connection that I hadn't made before. And I've been trying to figure out, I'm a relative newcomer to this world, and I had been, and I'm fairly passionate about environmental concerns. And I realized that I think the reason why I'm trying to bring these two together so much, and why I think these small water farmers have so much to give in terms of an environmental message, is because they have passion, right? They have a really deep passion for what they do and what they're producing, and they're really proud of what they're selling. And so if you can take that passion, and in many cases this is already happening in these companies, in other cases they may not yet really have a very concrete or strong environmental message. But I feel like because it's water, because water is symbolic, because it's so central to our lives, all of the themes of this series, I think that passion is really well placed to be combined with a passion about preservation and sustainability and education that is really exciting to me. Like, I really think that there's a road here that these companies can take if they're not already, that can really be making a big difference.
Yeah, so I think the passion is really important. And usually when you talk to a person that's passionate about his product, the thing he will never tell you is, this is the best water. They will tell you what makes the water unique, what is the character of my water. But because he has passion for water, doesn't mean I have only passion for my water. I have passion for water in general. And those people are very open-minded to understand that other people also have very interesting waters. So those people feel very comfortable in what I call a portfolio. They understand that people want to have different experiences. Same thing, if you talk to a winemaker, very hardly will ever tell you, this is the best wine in the world. No, they understand it has a certain quality, but there are other things that also have quality because the people are passionate about wine. So I think companies that we're talking about, they're passionate about water and they enjoy their water. They think it's very unique. They want you to drink their water, but they will never say it's better water than this one here. They will tell you it's a different water. So many water companies that you experience on the other side of our continuum, a little bit more to the right, more the spreadsheet companies, they will tell you this is the best water. And they will say, this is the only thing you should be drinking because I need to get my spreadsheets up. And by doing that, they're not passionate about water, they're passionate maybe about their water as it expresses itself in the spreadsheet. What that means is they also will not give you a choice. They will say, it's our water or it's nothing because we have the best water. And what this means is that water becomes boring because you suddenly don't have a choice anymore. And if I go to a restaurant here in the US and many places in Europe as well, my choice is still in sparkling. And it's not many different brands of still in sparkling, it's San Pellegrino and Panna. Those are my choices. So it becomes boring, but it doesn't mean the water is not good, the water is interesting, but it becomes boring if this is my only thing I can have access to. And if the big company tells me, this is the only thing you should be drinking, and we make sure that in a restaurant, in a place, this is the only water I have. So we will talk in the future about restaurants and how to get water out there, but I think that's really, really important to understand that the small companies like water, the other companies only like their water.
Yeah, I don't have a lot to add to that. I think that's definitely the case, and I think that we've talked about this personally. And whenever I go into a restaurant, I always try to see what's on the menu, and oftentimes there isn't a lot of choice. Right? In France, the choices might be slightly different. Right? There's inevitably Badois on the menu, and I don't think that brand is always available elsewhere. But it does become a little boring because people don't understand that there maybe are different kinds of carbonation, right? If they've only had Perrier, then carbonated water is very, very carbonated, has very big bubbles. And likewise, if they've only had a sort of 200 TDS water, they may really not have any idea how to experience something that's a 3000 TDS water with more sodium in it. So, obviously this is something that we're both passionate about, this idea that you can pair water and food, water and wine, that different waters have different character, and that these small farmers are all contributing to that diversity in ways that are really fun.
Yeah, it's the same. Like imagine you go to a restaurant and the chef gives you a tasting menu, 5-course, 6-course tasting menu, and the choice of wine is red or white. That's equivalent to what we have right now in the water industry. And we have all these beautiful waters from those small farms, so to speak, from these small water farmers, from these artisanal producers. But in the restaurant world, it's really very hard to get people to understand that they need to upgrade their water service as well. Martin Reese has done a fantastic job in Los Angeles, got a lot of media attention for having a water menu there and providing this kind of services. And we see, as the trend grows, this will be part of it because we think the chef needs to care where the food is coming from, the sommelier where the wine is coming from, and someone in the restaurant needs to care where the water is coming from, and giving the clients an integrated experience by showing to them where every part of their meal is coming from as part of the experience.
Yeah, there's even a movement to use different kinds of waters in cooking, right? So that it's not just the water you're drinking in the glass, but it's, are your carrots prepared in Vichy water, right? Like what water do you use when you're making chocolate? So it's really makes it part of that whole culinary world. in a way that's really fun. And I think that, you know, again, because water has this symbolism, you can't just throw water into the market and expect no backlash. I mean, I think that's where I come in, right? Is I'm trying to understand this backlash, trying to distinguish these companies from these bigger companies and see, okay, well, how can these small companies address that head on so that they're behaving responsibly and we can enjoy this product while feeling confident that these companies are paying attention to these issues.
Yeah, so I think, you know, this might be a good point to conclude this episode. I want to mention this is the first time that we, in public, so to speak, mentioned this concept of the small water farmer. And we will probably get a lot of feedback, especially I'm curious to get the feedback from the people we're actually talking about, what they think about the concept. But I want to mention, it's not that we want to try them into farmer. It's a concept that we want to put out there for people to understand and tap into some equity into understanding what we believe those people contribute to your Epicurean experience if they're allowed to.
Yeah, I agree. I think that this is, I mean, we'll see. I'm really curious to see what people think of this idea. You know, it came kind of naturally into our conversations. It made perfect sense to us to think of it that way, but it'll be nice to get some feedback and to interact with the people who are going to be most impacted by this new vocabulary. So next time, I guess we'll be talking about symbolism. So what makes water so symbolic? Really dig into that, because as Michael said, my byline is always that it's complicated. But you know, saying that, it becomes then my responsibility to try to break that down and to make complicated things, you know, to create a narrative where those complicated things are made up of smaller, less complicated pieces, so that we can try to understand the world that way.
So you're making one big complicated things into many small complicated things.
No, the individual pieces are less complicated, but when you put them all together, then it's you know, the whole is more complex.
I can't wait. We have been waiting for you and your help for a long time. I'm very much looking forward to explaining everything. Thank you very much.
Bye, Michael. See you next time.